From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Ashley Afonso. It's been almost 7 months since the new administration entered the White House. Since then, we've seen a flurry of presidential orders, cabinet nominations, and some controversy to go along with it. During his campaign, President Trump's agenda included trimming the national budget, job creation, infrastructure improvements, and health care reform. Congress was scheduled to recess in August, but that may now change if they don't get some legislation passed. Joining me today to discuss what's going on in Washington is Dr. Tim Versalati, professor of political sciences and director of the Polling Institute at Western New England University. First of all, thank you for being here today with us.
Oh, good to be here.
Well, let's start with what has the Trump administration accomplished since they've been in office?
If you were to look back over the past few months, the major achievements so far have been outside the legislative arena. The president has filled a Supreme Court vacancy. Neil Gorsuch is on the court, filling the seat left open for more than a year by the death of Antonin Scalia. The president has rolled back some regulations in the area of environmental protection through executive order. He has gotten his travel ban, or part of it, in place. That took quite some time and was only through the intervention of the Supreme Court, which lifted a stay while the court decided whether to take up the case, which it will in the fall. So he has had some achievements, but he hasn't had that big legislative win yet that presidents like to get in the first few months in office.
Okay, you mentioned some of the appointments, some of the cabinet appointments. Some of them have come with controversy. Is this common, no matter the president, Republican or Democrat?
Well, it depends on the nominee. So some of the president's nominees drew more controversy than others. The ones that come to mind are Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General, Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. These were individuals who are fairly polarizing figures in terms of public policy, and Sessions in terms of his voting history in the Senate. There were other nominees, though, that went through without very much difficulty. So it really varies by personality, by individual. And the level of controversy is not that different from what you'd see at the start of most presidential administrations.
Okay, switching gears here to the stock market. It's been doing pretty well since President Trump took office. Does this have to do with the economy's ongoing recovery and some optimism from Americans?
I think the term you used, ongoing, is a good way to describe the economic recovery. We've seen consistent job growth over time. The most recent report in June was 222,000 new jobs, unemployment staying at about 4.4%, wages rising, continuing a very gradual rise. In other words, the trends that finished the Obama administration are continuing, and so that suggests at least the market is not spooked by controversy or spooked by conflict over some of the president's proposals.
Do you think this will continue, or will we start to see a decline at some point?
I think the markets are wondering what's going to happen with health care, and a lot will depend on whether the Congress can pass a health care bill and then what's in the bill, or if the status quo continues in terms of the Affordable Care Act.
Okay, switching gears to a popular topic we've seen in the news a lot lately, the Russian interference in the U.S. election. How much of an impact has this had on the administration's effectiveness so far?
I think it's had a big impact. What we've seen is almost any time the president seems to have a decent news cycle, seems to come off an event in which he has appeared in a generally favorable light, Russia rears its head again. And we saw that the president had just returned from the G20 summit, and not an entire success for him, but his staff felt that he had done very well at the summit, returns, and we get these news revelations about Donald Trump Jr. meeting with a Russian lawyer. And so it seems like this is an issue that is just dogging the president and will continue to dog the president, because we've got investigations in the House, in the Senate, and under the special counsel, Robert Mueller. So this isn't going away, and who knows where it's headed.
So what does the Trump administration need to do to be more effective?
Well, One thing that I've observed about how President Trump relates to the Republicans in Congress is that they don't always sing from the same songbook here. The Republicans have a 46-seat majority in the House of Representatives, a slimmer 4-seat majority in the Senate, but with a tie-breaking vote in Vice President Pence. And yet, they have trouble getting legislation through, in part because the president mixes his signals. The bill that the House passed on health care reform was lauded initially, then he turned around and said, no, it's a mean bill, and I hope the Senate will come up with something more humane. The Senate slowed down on health care reform, and the president said, well, instead of repeal and replace, maybe we just go with repeal. Each of these statements seems to catch legislative leaders off guard, and so there doesn't seem to be a coherent strategy to get things through the Congress. If the White House would address that, if the president would conduct himself with a little more message discipline and policy discipline in terms of working with leaders in Congress, they might get more accomplished.
Okay, most recently, President Trump's son, revelations we've heard about him, how does that affect credibility?
This was a real hit for the Trumps. The question of whether the Russians influenced the election or interfered with the election, these allegations were things that the Trump family had said over and over, didn't happen, didn't occur, there's nothing to it, fake news. But then this most recent set of revelations, Donald Trump Jr. met with a Russian lawyer. She came promising information on Hillary Clinton, or at least that's how the meeting was set up. The Russian lawyer has said in interviews, no, I didn't have anything on Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump Jr. said in his email he's very eager to hear of such things. And so he has known, the president's son has known for a year that this occurred, and yet he has said over and over, no contact with the Russians, nothing has occurred. And so that was a huge credibility hit for the Trump family, and by extension the president, although the president maintained he had no knowledge of that meeting. It's hard to regain credibility after something like that, and it's going, those matters aren't going away because of these investigations, and so it's very hard to predict what effect this will have as the term unfolds.
All right, we'll continue this conversation after a short break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about Congress and President Trump's agenda for the nation. The president has talked about infrastructure, new construction and repairs, from roads and bridges to a security wall at the border with Mexico. What are the chances that Congress will pass a bill that would allow some funding for these projects?
Well, there are two sets of projects here. One is an infrastructure bill, which would be almost an omnibus bill with highway improvements, mass transit improvements, airport improvements. The other issue is the ongoing funding of the federal government, and it's from that second pool of money that the money for the wall on the Mexican border would come from. The infrastructure bill, that's down on the agenda. There is a lot of other legislation ahead, tax reform, for example, and a budget. The federal fiscal year runs out September 30th. So in terms of the federal budget, there were some revelations last week about how to pay for the wall with Mexico. It's estimated this wall would cost about $22 billion. The Homeland Security Department portion of the federal budget, which was introduced in the House last week, is about $44 billion. $1.6 billion is there for preliminary construction of the border wall. Democrats have said there's no way they're voting for a budget that includes money for a border wall. In the House of Representatives, that's not a big problem because the Republicans have a large majority. The Senate, however, because of its rules involving filibusters, a federal budget's going to need 60 votes. The Republicans have 52. So it's likely that the Democrats in the Senate would block any bill that had money for a border wall, and we'd risk seeing a government shutdown at midnight on the last day of the federal fiscal year, September 30th. So will that money for the border wall be approved or not? that's one of those issues where we're just going to have to stay tuned and see what happens in the Senate.
Do you expect a shutdown on the last day of the fiscal year?
We've had them before, and President Trump has said if that's what it takes to hammer something through, he's not opposed to it. So again, these things are hard to predict. We had one in 2013. It was a disaster for the Republicans. They took most of the blame for it. It was over Obamacare. And so you have to be very careful with something like a government shutdown, because you're putting people on layoff there, you're shutting down national parks, you're slowing down essential services. It's not something you want to do lightly, but President Trump has said he's willing to go to the mat if he has to on some of these issues.
Okay, Senator Mitch McConnell has said that he's willing to delay the summer recess if the Senate doesn't come up with a health care bill. What's in that bill, and why are not all Republicans for it?
That's an interesting point. And that August recess is sacred. And the idea that the majority leader is saying, no, you've got to stay in town, the optics are bad, we can't leave until we get this done, it speaks to the stakes on that health care bill. It's a complex bill, but one of the key issues in that bill is Medicaid funding. So Medicaid is, among many things, health insurance for the poor, also funding for people in nursing homes, people who have exhausted their own resources. In the proposed healthcare reforms that are before the Senate, Medicaid funding, the increase in the funding would be capped. That would be for the first time in the program's history. And there are Republican senators from states that accepted expanded Medicaid funding under Obamacare who don't want to see that money go away. And those are key states: Ohio, West Virginia, Colorado, Nevada, Maine. Senators from those states have said, we can't support a bill that shuts off the growth in Medicaid spending because the costs in that area continue to go up. And so that's why Republicans are having a hard time coalescing around this issue. There are some trade-offs. Senators from some of those states would like to see more funding for opioid addiction treatment, and so Mitch McConnell is trying to bring them on board with that as well. But the whole healthcare legislative drama highlights the divisions, strong, deep divisions in the Republican Party. Controlling a chamber doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to get bills through easily, and this is a great illustration of that.
What wording do you think needs to be part of this bill to maybe get more people on common ground with this?
In order to get, and it's interesting, in the Senate, ordinarily the Democrats could filibuster and you'd need 60 votes. The Republicans only have 52. This bill, though, is being pushed through under budget reconciliation rules where you just need a simple majority. So all they need are 50. The Republicans could even afford to lose 2 of their 52. And a tie vote, the vice president would break the tie. And so some of the sweeteners that are in there are, in addition to more money for opioid addiction treatment, more money to support high-risk insurance pools so that people who are going into the pool with significant illnesses or other health problems, there'd be money there to bring down the costs of premiums. There are a lot of things they could do, but if they go too far, then the budget hawks in the Senate, the staunch fiscal conservatives, are going to say, we're spending too much money on this, now we're not going to support it. So it's a very careful balancing act that Mitch McConnell has to go through right now.
Okay, switching gears, recent data shows that more Americans are for alternative energy, but the president seems to support some of the older ways, coal and other forms like that. What do you see for future energy policy?
Well, that's been an interesting subject to watch. During the campaign, candidate Trump at that point in time, in key swing states, Pennsylvania and Ohio, less swingy but important to his electoral college victory, Kentucky and West Virginia, all coal states. President Trump said, I'm bringing the coal jobs back. And he has continued that emphasis when energy experts, and I have to admit, I'm not an energy expert, I'm just reading what I see in the paper and online, say, obviously the future is in renewable energy sources. Natural gas has surpassed coal as a preferred source of energy in manufacturing. But the president feels he has to keep his promise to coal, to voters in those coal states. And so the Energy Secretary, Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, was recently at a clean coal plant, a plant that could burn coal with fewer of the environmental ill effects that we see from coal burning plants. Rick Perry was there saying clean coal is the fuel of the future. I don't think that's a majority view in the country, but the president feels like he needs to follow that path because he's keeping a campaign promise to the voters.
Okay, when we return, we'll discuss international policy. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the issues facing Congress and our nation. President Trump recently returned from the G20 summit. He's expressed wanting to withdraw from the Paris Global Accord on climate change. Some states are choosing to endorse the Paris Global Accord, including Massachusetts. How will that impact any of our national energy policy?
It's a great question about federalism, isn't it? Is this the responsibility of the federal government? I think most people would agree it is, but if the federal government says, no, we're not interested, then the states can step in, including Massachusetts. And there are a lot of creative things that states can do in terms of climate change. Under the Paris Accord, the United States is trying to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 26% from 2005 levels by 2025. How can states do that? Well, they can do it through negotiating their energy contracts with suppliers, buying more renewable energy in terms of the mix between renewables and traditional fossil fuels. In terms of business incentives, states can come up with policies that encourage and reward businesses for using renewable energy as well. And with creativity in terms of mass transit and transportation planning, states can have an impact there as well. It's not the same as a unified 50-state strategy, but it is a way that individual states that disagree with the president can be proactive about climate change.
Okay, the past few weeks we've been hearing a lot about the G20 summit. For those who don't know, can you explain what it is and why it's so important to the U.S.?
The G20 is an interesting group of nations because it's a mix of the industrialized nations, the traditional powerhouses that we're familiar with, the United States, the European nations, China, Russia, but also the emerging economies of the Southern Hemisphere, so Brazil, for example, Indonesia, Mexico, in terms of Asia, India as part of the G20. Why does it matter? The leaders of these nations come together and talk about big picture issues and set goals in terms of their agenda. So they talk about trade, for example. And there are a lot of sideline conversations between individual leaders in terms of not really hammering out trade agreements, but setting agendas for future bilateral talks or maybe even multilateral talks. The G20 talks about immigration, how to deal with refugee issues, and how to deal with climate change. In this particular meeting, it went from the G20 to the G19 because 19 of the 20 countries reiterated their commitment to the Paris Climate Accord. The United States was the odd country out in that regard because of the president's position.
Okay, and that brings me to my next question. How is the U.S. currently viewed internationally in the diplomatic community?
Well, it's very interesting watching how our traditional allies have responded since President Trump took office. There's no denying that the United States is a global superpower. You can't isolate or ignore the United States, and yet some leaders have been trying to figure out a way to work with the United States while also maintaining support back home in countries that may not have a very positive view of President Trump. And so we've seen Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, try and navigate that. Trump is not very popular in the UK, but Prime Minister May sees that the United States is a critical trading partner, especially as the UK leaves the EU. We see the newly elected president of France, Emmanuel Macron, who met with President Trump last week, invited him to Paris for Bastille Day celebrations, recognizing that you've got to find a way to work with the United States. Angela Merkel, who is generally perceived as the leader of the Western Bloc, if you exclude the United States, she's the Chancellor of Germany, has been more confrontational with President Trump over specific issues, and she has come away with her initial dealings saying, I think we need to rely less on our traditional allies, which was a very powerful statement for the leader of Germany to say. And so Trump has raised some doubts about his commitment to NATO. That is a bedrock of organizing, the organizing principles between our alliances with countries in Western Europe. That has not sat well with Merkel. So of the leaders of our allies, I think she has taken the most skeptical or cautious view of dealing with President Trump.
Okay, if you can give us the short version of what is happening in North Korea and what needs to be done to defuse that situation. They seem to be looking for a fight.
Well, that is certainly true. Earlier this month, they launched an intercontinental ballistic missile. The estimates are that it wouldn't be long before they have a missile that could actually reach Alaska, so U.S. territory. There are no easy answers to that. There are no easy solutions. President Trump had hoped to rely on China to intervene with North Korea. China has not been assertive in that area. There is speculation that the president's advisors are preparing short-term military interventions that might target facilities in North Korea. That's iffy, though, because the response could be a devastating attack on South Korea with a lot of casualties. And so it's very hard to predict what's going to happen in our dealings with North Korea. Diplomacy might be the safest route, but President Trump seems to be convinced that diplomacy has not been productive in the past.
Okay, and we'll have the last word after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about what the Trump administration and Congress hope to accomplish before the summer recess. We want to say thank you to Dr. Tim Versalati for being here on the program today. And that's our program for today. Thank you for watching at home. And if you missed any of it, you can find it on our website, wwlp.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday.